Hello and welcome back to the Student Hub Live. Well, if you're watching in real time, we've just had the most fascinating discussion about Trump in America and the state of politics and international relations. And if you missed that, you might want to watch it on the catch-up. But there's more to discussing politics and international relations to being an OU student. And here we're going to talk about assessment, which is an area of key concern. And I'm delighted to be joined by Judith Pickering and Peter Taylor. Thank you for giving us a 101 assessment survival guide.
You're welcome.
So, we've got two widgets up on the screen now and we'd like you to vote on them. They are, how comfortable do you feel about assessment? Are you comfortable or do you feel daunted? So put something on that scale to let us know where you feel. There's also a word cloud, which is what feelings do you associate with assessment? Now, there are three choices there and it won't submit unless you put three things in those boxes. So if you can't think of three, that's fine. Just put a full stop so that at least the results will populate. When you vote, you can also see some of the things that other people have added, which is a very nice thing to do as well. So this is all about new students. Some of them are coming to the Open University firsthand, but we do have a lot of regulars. And again, if you've got tips and advice to share, please do that in the chat. But the Open University, the whole purpose, I guess, of distance education is this idea of us sending you stuff, you then doing some assessment to show us that you understand it. And there is a lot of assessment at the Open University, and these are tutor-marked assignments. So, Peter, broadly speaking then, how does the OU deal with assessment, and what's the sort of name of the game then?
So, I think you need to remember that assessment is not just about marks, it's about teaching and learning as well. So, the assessment that you get as a student will be asking you questions, you'll be replying to them, and they will be graded. But you'll get feedback from that assessment. So the feedback will be identifying your strengths and weaknesses, helping you develop your understanding and preparing for the next assignment. So it's a lot more than just kind of getting grades, although grades are important. It's about that kind of learning process. And so when we design a module, when we design a qualification, we're looking at putting in those assessment points, working out what we need to ask, what the student needs to do, and revealing what they understand and what they don't understand, and therefore what the associate lecturer can provide in terms of supporting that student to move on.
We've got some sessions later about how to make the most use of your tutor throughout that process. But I was talking to Meg John Barker earlier about caring for yourself in your studies, and we were talking about this idea of assessment and the grades and the feedback and trying to be kind to ourselves when we're including that and learning from that experience. Judith, what's your role in this process, and how would you advise students to sort of take this, what can be quite a scary process, and view it as a really important part of their learning?
I completely agree. It's a scary part of the process. I mean, I was fortunate enough to do some study last year, and I sat an exam, 3-hour written exam, for the first time in about 20-odd years. That's giving away my age a little bit. And even though I work in assessment, I manage the assessment programme, I was petrified, so I completely understand how students feel. And it is important to look after yourself and learn. So, with the OU, it's not just about doing exams, final exams. There's a lot of assessment that leads up to that. So using that assessment and looking at your tutor feedback and actually reflecting on that and then talking to your tutor about your feedback is all part of the learning process. So it's important to engage with that, and that will help prepare you for sitting an exam or doing your end of module assessment as well.
Now, last night we had a session on the virtual learning environment, and we were talking about where you access your TMAs and the study calendar. And we were also talking about the assessment guidance and how important that was for students in terms of understanding how the actual assessment was put together throughout the course or module that they were looking at. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, so what's important to realise before we look at the site is that the site has a discussion about that central bit about what you're meant to study and when, and interleaved with that are the assessment dates. And they're kind of, as I said, designed to reinforce. They're not randomly put there, they're actually there to kind of help you learn. So, I mean, if we look at a typical VLE here, so right the way down the middle, we've got the various things you need to do, and there at the bottom of that you've got TMA02. So it's telling you what kind of, when your TMA is and what you've got to do. So looking at the whole timetable will give you those dates of the assignments, and You can put them in your diary so that you know they're coming up, maybe putting in a reminder a few weeks earlier so that you can know when to start thinking about it.
Now, I've talked to various people over the last few days, and we've been talking about how, while some students might want to get ahead, for a lot of students, they're doing the assignment in the week that's scheduled for that, so it's quite acceptable to ask your tutors for help and support at that particular moment. But I've also heard that looking forward in terms of what the assessment is can help with focused reading and can actually help direct your studies. So what would your take be in terms of your assessment leads head on, How would you advise students deal with this? Would you suggest that they look at things earlier or in the week that they're doing it?
I think when we design modules, we try to design them for the average student working at a particular rate. And we know that for some students, life just isn't like that. So there'll be times when you do need to get ahead, times when you know you're going to be a bit behind, but you'll be able to catch up later. So it's important to kind of plan the year, really, knowing when you'll have the opportunity to get ahead, when you'll have the opportunity to catch up. And I think that's how you need to work. The issue comes in that when an assignment has a cut-off date, you can't get feedback until that cut-off date has passed. So even though you might be ahead, you might submit something in good time, you're not really going to hear back till after the cut-off date.
Yeah. So that's in terms of actually doing the assessment. But what about finding out when these are due and actually having a look at some of the questions?
So, well, usually they're up on the VLE, the dates, and for most modules, the assessment questions will be available. Okay. For some of the newer courses, which are kind of just being delivered, then maybe some of the later assignments may not be there yet. But in general, they'll be there, and so you can start planning them. But the problem is that a lot of the questions won't make sense. Yeah. Until you've had the opportunity to study the material.
And do all the reading.
So don't don't start looking at assignments and saying, gosh, I don't understand what all that means, because it will become clear.
Yeah. Now, there are ways that we direct students to tackle these assignments. They get student notes, so that will have a lot of guidance about where they might look, things they might like to include. Sometimes it'll have process and content words. So it'll give students an idea, I guess, about what the marker's looking for in terms of completing that. And we also have this assessment, which will be throughout the whole module. So that might cover things like referencing, word limits, and all those other important things that aren't going to be replicated in each assignment particularly. How do students navigate that, and where do they find out where those various aspects are?
Okay, well, there's loads of information available online particularly, so if we just click through, so again, this is your module website. This is the New Look module website. I believe someone walked everyone through this yesterday.
Yes,
actually.
We had a thorough look through last night, and if you missed that, it's available on the catch-up service.
So on the new website, there'll be an assessment tab where you will be able to access your assessment, and you'll be able to see what marks you've got for assessment that you've completed. You'll also be able to get access to your assessment strategy and other assessment information in there. So module-specific assessment guidance will be available from that tab. There's also, if you go to Student Home, you'll be able to access, this is a student home page, you'll be able to access the Help Centre from that page. There's a tab at the top. And if we go through to the next slide, these are just some examples of where you can get some more generic information, advice and support around how to tackle assessment from the Help Centre. So here you can see there are study skills, and it tells you how to sort of prepare for your assignments, different types of assignments, how to write for the OU, and then again, if you look at assessment and exams, there's some advice and guidance about how to prepare for exams, how to manage stress, because I know people get stressed, I certainly did, but there are ways of dealing with that, and being prepared is one of the best ways. So you can see here that there's lots of information, just worth just going through and having a look, read through there and see what you can find. And if you've got any questions, do get back to your tutor about those.
I'd like to pick up on that idea next, but people are talking about there being a lot of different types of assessment, and you've mentioned exams. We've also seen end of module assessments, which were there. I saw an ICMA before. What's that?
So one of the things that when you start the course, there should be a module guide, and the module guide has all the kind of descriptions of the course. And in there will be an assessment strategy. And the assessment strategy would describe the various types of assessments there'll be, whether there's a tutor-marked assignment, whether there's an exam or some kind of end-of-course essay. But there might also be these kind of computer-marked assignments, and these are interactive computer-marked assignments. So they're online, so you go online, and it's a very sophisticated multi-choice type question. Some of them are drag and drop, others are just choosing particular questions, rearranging sentences. But it's a different kind of online assessment that is computer marked, and you get feedback from that as well. So you don't just get feedback from the tutor marked assignment, you also get it from the computer marked assignment. And as I said, the assessment strategy as described in the module guide usually tells you how much weighting there is, so the significance of each of those in the detail. You mentioned the kind of whole thing around things like referencing and the like. Well, often that's described in a separate assessment guide, so it's usually as a separate document on the right-hand side. There's an assessment guide which will tell you all the things you need to know around assessment. So it'll describe each of the different types of assessment activities.
And it also contains important information about perhaps which pieces of assessment may be substitutable, which can be a really nice thing for students to know about. So it's worthwhile reading up on. Peter, you've been talking about end-of-module assessments and exams, and I wonder if you can clarify the difference between those compared to a TMA, a tutor-marked assignment.
So you're doing your tutor-marked assignments, and tutor-marked assignments, there are deadlines, and then your tutor will be marking them and sending them back. At the very end, there's usually what we call a synoptic activity. It's about the whole course rather than just on the bit you've been studying, which is what usually the TMA is about. So this whole course activity is usually something like an examination, a conventional examination, where you go to a particular centre, and there's invigilators, and there's the whole drama of the exam where you're kind of sitting there and you turn over the paper and you pick up your pen and the clock starts running and your brain completely empties.
Just sweating away, remembering.
and so there are those type of activities, but there are also these kind of end-of-module assignments, which are much bigger essays. So they're like a TMA, but they're not an exam. You don't go away and write it. You write them. You have a certain number of weeks to produce it, but it's a much bigger synoptic piece of work.
See, we joke about the sweating at exams. I don't know many people who don't, to be fair. I actually found that I often used to do better at exams than I did with an EMA because I liked the idea of cramming. And also, I know when I've marked EMAs or exams, you're expected to do a lot less in an exam because you can't write as long an essay. You're having to do different sorts of things. There can be natural anxiety associated with exams, but these are all pieces of assessed work. Judith, I mean, you've obviously lived through the exam, but for some students who may have that at the end of the module, what would your advice be in terms of viewing this as a piece of assessment? Are people trying to trick you? How do you get guidance and support in terms of how you're studying for that sort of piece?
No, you're right. People aren't trying to trick you. There won't be any sort of questions in there that you wouldn't have covered throughout your module. I think probably the best way to prepare, and what I did as well, was to look at past exam papers, and those are now available, and to do some of those and try and doing some of those in timed conditions at home. So if it's a 3-hour exam, get a past paper, set your timer, run through it in 3 hours, don't be distracted by anything. Don't be tempted to look at books if that's not allowed in the exam, and just see how you go. You can look at potentially some sort of proposed answers and see how they map, and that will give you a sense of what to expect and an idea of have you managed to answer all the questions in time in the time available, and give you some idea of what more work you might need to do to prepare for the exam. But it probably also, as I've found, gave me a lot of reassurance. Actually, no, I can do this. I've only got a little bit of extra work to do. I can sort of touch up in these areas. So that I actually found that helped a lot. The worst thing for me was the thought of, because I don't write, the thought of just writing constantly for 3 hours was the thing that worried. You have to practice. So use exactly the same sort of conditions as you would in a normal exam. So don't be tempted to type the answers if you can't type the answers in the exam. Use a pen and try out lots of different pens and different pen sizes and things like that. and just try and replicate that exam experience at home beforehand if you can.
I mean, they're less and less common now as more and more modules are shifting towards various types of assessment and end of modules. Peter, you've marked a lot of exams in your time. When you've been thinking about marking those, how has that process been in terms of seeing what students know?
Well, fairly straightforward in terms of when I set an exam question, I'm not trying to trick anybody, because I don't need to kind of be too sophisticated in my questions, because really what I'm trying to do in exam conditions where I know the student has got limited time and they've also got no other resources, is I want them to be able to do their best and show me what they know. And so I want to try and write questions which are fairly straightforward. So there's a couple of basic kind of things I rely on students doing. One is to read the paper. There's usually a specimen examination paper which we send out, which will have the same rubric, the same design in terms of the numbers of questions, the type of questions, whether you need to answer questions from section A, B or C or whatever. So looking at that and understanding what the paper will look like should be no surprise to you then when you get into the exam. It should be of that same format. Then reading the questions and understanding what they're really asking, and thinking of what kind of answer that you can give to the question. Not an answer to the question you would like to have had, which is sometimes what I see when I'm marking, but actually what the question is asking. And making a decision about which questions you're going to do, and based upon the weightings, allotting the time accordingly. So if you kind of say, I've got 6 questions to do in 3 hours, and I've got half an hour on each question, and I aim to finish after half an hour and stop and then move on to the next one. Because if I spend 45 minutes on the first question, then I'm never going to finish the last one. So often when I'm marking exams, I'm seeing a lot of, a really good first question, which is full of, and then the last question is kind of scribbled down with bullet points because it's clear the person's run out of time. So that time management is quite important in an exam.
And we'll be doing other Student Hub Live events later about exactly how to cope with exam conditions. So select the Count Me In button and we'll keep you up to date with when we have those. Sophia Ivan.
Yes, some really good chat on here. A bit of a competition about who's doing the most words in their essay coming up. But we have a question from Jordan, who is actually studying in Spain. And his next module, he has an exam. So how would that work if he's studying abroad at the moment?
Usually, we try and set up an examination centre abroad. You may have to travel further because the distance that we can set up the exam obviously is more difficult, and there may be an extra cost because of setting up a separate exam centre. But we've had exams all over the world. We've had exams in submarines, we've had exams in war zones, we've had exams on board boats. So we're pretty good at setting exams up in interesting places.
Are there any other urgent questions we need to address from the hot desk? Because we do have a session with Georgina next about getting the most support from your tutor, and some of this is needlessly to say going to cover assessment. But Ivan, anything else?
Not really. I mean, Sylvia said that she's doing an MA in classical studies, and she struggled with the last TMA. So there is a question there about support. And then Jordan says he doesn't really get nervous. Jordan, he gets nervous and not scared, sorry. So yeah, I guess it's all good in the chat so far.
Excellent. Now, some nerves are very good and very useful. They help you think on your toes, don't they? I'd like to leave everything to Georgina about the tutor support for students, but from an assessment perspective, what should students expect in terms of support? So Georgina will talk about how to offer that support or how that might happen for students. But broadly speaking, what should students expect?
So you should be expecting good feedback on your assessment.
By good, you don't mean like, this is really brilliant work,
No,
Karen.
No, but helpful assessment, feedback on the assessment. So I tutor on a course, and when I get my TMAs in, I'm looking and I'm trying to kind of work out what best comments I can give to help the student to get the kind of to help them understand where they've gone wrong and what they can do to kind of sort out their misunderstandings. And so one of my concerns is that, I might give the student 65%, and then it pings into their kind of tutor home. They see they've got 65%, and they're busy and they think, I'll look at that feedback later, and they never quite get round to looking at it. So making sure that they're looking at the feedback, because actually that's probably one of the most important bits of support you're going to get from your tutor. So, if it takes 45 minutes, an hour or so to mark each assignment, that's individualised personal teaching that you don't get anywhere else within the module. So it's probably, one of the most valuable things that you'll get.
And such a unique thing to the OU as well,
Yeah.
because where else do you get such detailed, in-depth feedback? And I'm going to talk to Georgina about what to do if you don't understand that, so do stay tuned for that. Judith, can we end with you talking a little bit about, again, what students might expect?
From their assessment?
Yeah.
Well, hopefully a level of challenge. It will help them sort of learn, as Peter has said. So they're not going to expect to be thrown into the deep end. If you're new students, don't expect you'll have to write a dissertation straight off the bat. So what we do here is very much develop your assessment skills as you progress through the Open University. So you can expect to be challenged, but not too much, and be supported by your tutor. So I think that's what I'd say you get from assessment, really.
There is some scary chat in the chat about essays of 3,000 words, but that doesn't come till later, does it, Peter?
No, so I teach on a postgraduate module, which is actually the very final 60 credits of kind of a dissertation. And it's 15,000 words, but that's all there is. I mean, there's no real study or TMAs. It's just producing this 15,000. So it's about starting where you are and building up as you go through the levels, level 1, level 2, level 3, to kind of to develop your kind of academic voice in terms of writing.
Some of my students on the second year module I teach complain about having only 1,000 words because the essays are very complex and there's so much to put in, and the skill there is being very brief. So words aren't always necessarily a good thing, are they?
And I always say to my students, because when they think they've got a 15,000 word dissertation to write, at the beginning they're always saying, how on earth am I going to... And I have to tell them that, by the time they get to the end, they'll be complaining that 15,000 words is not enough. You'd be surprised how quickly it kind of it's taken up.
Well, thank you both so much for coming along and talking to us today. I think the take-home message from this session really is that this assessment is not here to trick you. It's to assess your learning outcomes. You've shown us how and when to find that guidance, and also to look at the modular assessment for the module and also the additional assessment for each TMA, ICMA, EMA and exam. And you've explained the differences between those as well really clearly. So thank you for that. If you do have any more questions, we can put those to Georgina in the next session when we're going to be talking about how to get the most from your tutor. So Judith, Peter, thank you so very much for coming along. We're now going to look at chaos theory for a quick ad break, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. So grab a cup of tea and join me for our next session where we're going to talk about making the most of your tutor.